David was sitting in his office on the 45th floor of his building in London when his phone rang, and the name on the screen made his heart beat faster because it was from his private investigator, a man named Thomas who had been searching for Margaret for the past 3 years. Thomas had called many times before with false leads and dead ends. Women who looked like Margaret but turned out to be strangers, and each time David would feel hope rise in his chest only for it to crash down again like a wave hitting the rocks. But something about this call felt different because when David answered the phone, Thomas did not sound tired or apologetic like he usually did when he had bad news. Instead, his voice was shaking with excitement like a man who had finally found treasure after digging for years. Thomas said the words that David had been waiting to hear for over 2 decades. He said, "Boss, I think we found her, and this time I am almost certain it is really your mother." David's hands began to tremble, and he had to sit down because his legs suddenly felt weak, and he asked Thomas to tell him everything from the beginning without leaving out any details. Thomas explained that his team had been searching through homeless shelters and street communities in Lagos for months, showing old photographs of Margaret and asking if anyone had seen a woman matching her description, and for a long time nobody recognized the face in the pictures. But then one of his local contacts who worked in the Oshodi market area told him about an old woman who had been living on the streets for many years, a woman who was quiet and kept to herself, but who was being cared for by a local food seller who brought her meals every single day. When the contact showed the photograph to some of the market traders, they said the woman in the picture looked like a younger version of the old widow, and one trader even remembered hearing the old woman mention that she had lost a son many years ago. David could barely breathe as he listened to Thomas speak, and his mind was racing with questions and fears and hopes that he had buried deep inside himself for so many years. He asked Thomas if he was sure, and Thomas said he could not be 100% certain until they did proper verification, but everything was pointing in the right direction. The age was right, the story matched, and the woman had a scar on her left hand that David had described in his files. That scar was important because David remembered how his mother had gotten it when he was just 5 years old. She had been cooking, and the hot oil had splashed on her hand, leaving a mark that never fully healed. When Thomas mentioned the scar, David knew in his heart that this was not another false lead. This was real, and his mother was alive, and she had been living on the streets of Lagos all these years while he was building his empire and living in luxury. The guilt hit him like a punch to the stomach, and he felt tears rolling down his face for the first time in many years because David had trained himself to be strong and not show emotions, but this news broke through all his walls. He told Thomas to book him a flight to Lagos immediately. He did not care about his business meetings or his schedule or any of the important things that were supposed to happen that week. The only thing that mattered was getting to his mother as fast as possible. Thomas tried to slow him down and suggested that maybe they should do more investigation first to make absolutely sure before David flew all the way to Nigeria. But David refused to wait even one more day because he had already waited 22 years, and every minute felt like torture. Within 3 hours, David was on his private jet flying from London to Lagos, and during the long flight, he could not sleep or eat or do anything except stare out the window and think about his mother and what he would say to her when they finally met. He thought about all the years she had suffered on the streets while he was sleeping in expensive hotels and eating in fancy restaurants, and he wondered if she would even recognize him because he was no longer the small 8-year-old boy she had lost in the fire. He was now a grown man with gray hairs beginning to show at his temples and lines on his face from years of stress and hard work, and he worried that maybe his mother would look at him and see a stranger instead of her son. But more than anything, David was thinking about the food seller that Thomas had mentioned, the poor man who had been feeding his mother every day for 5 years, and he felt a deep gratitude in his heart for this stranger who had shown kindness to Margaret when the whole world had abandoned her. David made a promise to himself that whoever this food seller was, he would repay him in ways that the man could never imagine because anyone who had taken care of his mother deserved to be blessed beyond measure. The plane landed in Lagos early in the morning, and Thomas was waiting at the airport with a car and driver ready to take David straight to Oshodi Market, where Margaret was last seen. As the car drove through the busy Lagos streets, David looked out the window at the city where he had been born, the city where he had lost everything and found nothing, and it felt strange to be back after so many years. The Lagos he remembered was a city of pain and loss, but now he was returning as a different person, a powerful man with money and influence who could make things happen, and he prayed that this power would help him find his mother and bring her home. When they arrived at Oshodi, the market was already alive with activity. Traders setting up their stalls, buses honking their horns, people rushing to and fro like ants on a mission, and somewhere in this chaos was the mother David had been searching for all his life. Thomas led him through the crowded market to the area where Samuel's food stall was located. And as they got closer, David could see a small wooden table with an old blue covering and a man standing behind it stirring a big pot of food. That must be him, David thought to himself. That must be the man who has been keeping my mother alive. But when they reached the stall and David looked around, he did not see any old woman sitting nearby. The spot where Margaret usually sat was empty, and there was no sign of her anywhere. David felt panic rising in his chest, and he walked up to Samuel and asked him where the old woman was, the one who usually sat across from his stall. Samuel looked at this well-dressed stranger with confusion and suspicion because he did not know who David was or why he was asking about Margaret. And in Lagos, you learn to be careful about strangers who ask too many questions. Samuel asked David who he was and why he wanted to know about the old woman. And for a moment, David did not know what to say, because how do you explain to a stranger that you are searching for a mother you lost 22 years ago? But then David took a deep breath and said something that made Samuel's eyes grow wide with shock. He said, "My name is David, and I believe that old woman is my mother." Samuel stared at David for a long moment, trying to process what he had just heard. And then his face changed from suspicion to something else, something that looked like hope mixed with sadness. Samuel said, "If you are truly her son, then you need to come with me right now because something happened to Margaret last night, and she is not doing well at all." David's heart dropped into his stomach, and he grabbed Samuel's arm and asked what happened. What is wrong with his mother? Samuel looked at David with heavy eyes and said the words that made David's world spin out of control. He said, "Last night some area boys attacked Margaret and tried to steal the small bag she always carries with her. And when she refused to let go, they beat her and left her bleeding on the ground. And now she is lying in a small clinic nearby, fighting for her life." David felt his knees go weak, and Thomas had to hold him up to stop him from falling. After searching for 22 years, David had finally found his mother. But now the question that haunted him was terrifying. Would Margaret survive long enough for him to tell her that her son had come home? David ran through the streets of Oshodi like a man possessed, following Samuel, who was leading him to the small clinic where Margaret was fighting for her life. And with every step David took, he prayed to God to please keep his mother alive just a little longer. The clinic was not a real hospital, but one of those small medical centers that poor people use when they cannot afford the big hospitals. A simple building with cracked walls and old equipment and nurses who did their best with very little resources. When they arrived, Samuel pushed open the door and led David down a narrow hallway that smelled like medicine and sadness. And at the end of the hallway was a small room with a thin curtain hanging in the doorway. Samuel stopped outside the room and turned to David with tears in his eyes. And he said, "She is in there, but I must warn you that she does not look the same as she probably did when you last saw her. Life has been very hard on her, and the beating last night made everything worse." David nodded, but he could not speak because there was a lump in his throat that felt like a stone, and his hands were shaking so badly that he had to clench them into fists to make them stop. He took a deep breath and pushed aside the curtain and stepped into the room, and what he saw made him fall to his knees right there on the dirty floor. Lying on the small bed was an old woman who looked so fragile that she might break if you touched her. Her face was swollen and bruised from the beating. Her lips were cracked and dry, and her eyes were closed like someone who had given up on life. But even through all the damage and all the years of suffering, David recognized her immediately, because a child never forgets his mother's face, no matter how much time has passed or how much she has changed. It was her. It was really her. It was Margaret, the woman who used to sing hymns in the kitchen while making breakfast, the woman who used to hold him close during thunderstorms and tell him that everything would be okay, the woman whose hand he had lost in the fire 22 years ago. David crawled to the side of the bed and took his mother's thin hand in his own. And the moment he touched her skin, he began to cry like he had never cried before. Deep, painful sobs that came from somewhere so deep inside him that he did not even know it existed. He said, "Mama, it is me. It is David. Your son has come home. Please wake up, Mama. Please do not leave me again." The nurse who was standing in the corner of the room looked at this well-dressed man crying on his knees, and she did not understand what was happening. But she could see that whatever was going on was something very deep and very painful. Samuel stood by the door watching the scene with his own tears falling freely because he had spent 5 years caring for this woman and hearing her talk about her lost son. And now that son was here kneeling by her bed begging her to wake up. For several minutes, nothing happened and David kept talking to his mother, telling her about all the years he had spent searching for her, telling her about Mr. Williams who had saved him and raised him, telling her about the business he had built and the success he had achieved, and promising her that if she would just wake up he would take her away from this place and give her the life she deserved. And then something miraculous happened. Margaret's fingers moved slightly, just a tiny twitch at first, but then her hand slowly closed around David's hand and held on like she was afraid he would disappear again. David gasped and leaned closer to his mother's face, and he watched as her eyes began to flutter open, slowly and painfully, like someone waking up from a very long and very dark dream. Margaret's eyes were cloudy and confused at first, and she seemed to not understand where she was or what was happening. But then her gaze focused on the face of the man leaning over her, and something changed in her expression. She stared at David for a long moment, studying his features like she was trying to solve a puzzle. And then her cracked lips began to move, and she whispered one word that made David's heart explode with joy. She whispered, "David." David nodded his head and said, "Yes, Mama, it is me. It is really me. I found you. I finally found you." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, and she reached up with her weak, trembling hand to touch David's face, and her fingers moved across his cheeks and his nose and his forehead like a blind person trying to see with their hands. She said, "My boy, my baby boy, you are alive. All these years I thought you were dead, but you are alive." David held his mother's hand against his face and kissed her palm and told her that he had never stopped looking for her, that he had spent millions of dollars and hired investigators all over the world because he refused to believe that she was gone forever. The nurse watching this reunion had to step outside because she was crying too hard to stay professional. And even Samuel, who was a strong man who had seen many difficult things in life, could not control his emotions. For the next hour, David sat by his mother's bed holding her hand and listening to her talk in her weak voice about everything she had been through, the years of homelessness, the hunger, the cold nights sleeping on the streets, and the cruelty of people who treated her like she was invisible. She told him about the night of the fire and how she had searched for him until she collapsed from exhaustion, and how the police had told her that he was probably dead because they never found his body. She told him about the years she spent walking the streets of Lagos hoping to see his face in the crowd, and how eventually she had given up hope and accepted that she would die alone without ever knowing what happened to her son. And then she told him about Samuel, the food seller who had saved her life. She said, "David, there is something you must know. For the past 5 years I would have died many times if not for that man standing by the door. He fed me every single day, even when he barely had enough for himself. He treated me with kindness when everyone else treated me like garbage. He is the reason I am still alive for you to find me." David looked at Samuel, who was standing quietly by the door, trying not to intrude on this family moment, and he saw the food seller in a different light now. This was not just a kind stranger. This was an angel that God had sent to watch over his mother until David could find her, and David knew that he owed this man a debt that could never be fully repaid. David stood up and walked over to Samuel and did something that shocked everyone in the room. He got down on his knees in front of the poor food seller and bowed his head to the ground. Samuel tried to pull him up and said, "No, no, what are you doing? A big man like you should not be kneeling for a poor man like me." But David refused to get up, and he said, "You saved my mother's life. You fed her when she was hungry. You showed her kindness when the world showed her cruelty. There is nothing I can do that will ever be enough to thank you, but I promise you this. From today, your life will never be the same." Samuel did not know what to say, and he just stood there with tears rolling down his face. And Margaret watched from her bed with a weak smile on her face because she knew that her son had grown into a good man with a grateful heart. The moment was beautiful and perfect, but it was about to be interrupted by something that nobody expected. The door of the clinic suddenly burst open, and a man walked in wearing an expensive suit and a gold watch. And behind him were two large men who looked like bodyguards. David turned around to see who had entered, and when he saw the man's face, his expression changed from joy to pure rage. The man in the expensive suit looked at David and smiled a wicked smile. And then he said, well, 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 little David has finally come home. I was wondering when you would show up. David's fists clenched and his jaw tightened, and he said one word through his teeth, a name that carried 22 years of hatred and pain. He said Uncle Patrick, the man who had thrown David and his mother onto the streets, the man who had stolen everything from them and left them to die, was now standing in the clinic doorway with a smile on his face. What does Patrick want after all these years? And what will happen when the man who destroyed David's family comes face to face with the billionaire that David has become? The war is about to begin. Subscribe now and turn on notifications because Chapter 5 will reveal secrets that will change everything you thought you knew about this story. Chief Patrick stood in the doorway of the small clinic with that wicked smile still on his face. And the years had been kind to him because he looked wealthy and well-fed like a man who had never known a day of suffering in his life. But David knew the truth about this man. He knew that every naira Patrick had was built on the pain and tears of others, starting with the widow and orphan he had thrown onto the streets 22 years ago. David stood up slowly and positioned himself between Patrick and his mother's bed like a lion protecting his family, and his eyes were cold and hard like two pieces of black stone. Patrick laughed and said, "Oh, how touching. The little boy has grown into a man who thinks he can protect his mother. But you are too late, David. You have always been too late." David asked Patrick what he was doing here and how he had found them, and Patrick laughed again like someone who was enjoying a private joke that nobody else understood. Patrick said, "Did you really think you could come to Lagos without me knowing about it? I have eyes and ears everywhere in this city. The moment your private jet landed at the airport, I knew you were here, and I knew exactly why you had come." David felt a chill run down his spine because he realized that Patrick had been watching him all along, waiting for this moment like a spider waiting for a fly to land in its web. Samuel stepped forward and asked who this man was and what he wanted, and Patrick looked at the food seller with disgust like he was looking at an insect that had crawled into his expensive shoe. Patrick said, "Who is this dirty man and why is he speaking to me? Does he not know who I am? I am Chief Patrick Okonkwo, one of the richest men in Lagos, and I do not have conversations with roadside food sellers." David told Samuel to stay back and let him handle this, and then he turned to Patrick and asked again what he wanted. Patrick's smile faded and his face became serious as he walked further into the room, his bodyguards following close behind him like shadows. He said, "I will tell you what I want, David. I want you to leave Lagos today and never come back. Take your mother with you if you want, but go far away and forget that this city exists." David laughed in Patrick's face and said, "Why would I do that? Lagos is my home. This is where I was born, and this is where my mother suffered because of you. If anyone should leave, it is you." Patrick's eyes flashed with anger, and he said, "You do not understand the situation, boy. You think because you have money now you are powerful, but I have something you do not have. I have connections in this city that go all the way to the top. Politicians, police chiefs, judges, they all eat from my hand." He stepped closer to David and lowered his voice to a threatening whisper, saying, "If you try to fight me, I will destroy you. I will make sure your businesses in Nigeria fail. I will make sure you cannot buy or sell anything in this country. And if that does not work, I will find other ways to deal with you, ways that are not so legal." David did not back down. Instead, he stepped forward until he was face to face with Patrick, and he said, "You do not scare me, uncle. You stopped scaring me the night you threw my mother and me onto the streets. That night you created a monster, and now that monster has come back to haunt you." The tension in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife, and everyone was holding their breath waiting to see what would happen next. Margaret tried to sit up in her bed, and she called out to Patrick with her weak voice, saying, "Patrick, please leave us alone. You have taken everything from us already. What more do you want?" Patrick looked at Margaret and his face twisted with something that looked like hatred mixed with fear, and David saw that look and knew immediately that there was something more going on here, something that Patrick was hiding. Patrick said to Margaret, "You should have stayed dead, old woman. Everyone thought you were dead, and that was good for everyone. But now you are alive and talking, and that is a problem." David grabbed Patrick by the collar of his expensive suit and pushed him against the wall, and the two bodyguards moved forward, but Patrick waved them back. David said, "What are you talking about? Why is my mother being alive a problem for you? What are you hiding, Patrick?" Patrick smiled that wicked smile again and said, "Oh, you do not know, do you? Your mother never told you the truth about your father, about how he really died, about the money that was supposed to be yours. David felt confused, and he looked at his mother, who had gone very pale and was shaking her head slightly, like she was begging Patrick to stop talking. David demanded to know what Patrick meant, and Patrick laughed with satisfaction because he could see that he had touched a nerve. Patrick said, "Your father, Joseph, did not just drive a taxi, David. He was also my business partner. We owned properties together, buildings and land that were worth millions even back then. And when he died, that money was supposed to go to you and your mother." David's eyes went wide because this was news to him. His mother had always told him that they were poor and that his father had left them nothing. Patrick continued talking and said, "But I could not let that happen, could I? A foolish woman and a small boy controlling millions of naira. So I made the papers disappear. I bribed the lawyers and the judges. I made everyone believe that your father had no property and no money, and I took everything for myself." The room went silent as the weight of Patrick's confession sank in, and David realized that his family had not just been robbed of their home. They had been robbed of a fortune that would have changed their lives completely. Samuel, who had been listening quietly, suddenly spoke up and said, "So you stole from a widow and orphan. You took what belonged to them and you left them to die on the streets. What kind of man does such a thing?" Patrick turned to Samuel with rage in his eyes and said, "I told you to stay out of this, you worthless food seller. This is family business, and it has nothing to do with you." But Samuel did not back down, and he said, "It has everything to do with me, because I have spent 5 years watching this woman suffer, 5 years feeding her and caring for her while you were living in luxury with money that belonged to her. So yes, this is my business now." David looked at Samuel with respect, because this poor man who had nothing was standing up to a rich and powerful chief without any fear, and David knew that he had found a true friend in this food seller. Patrick looked around the room at all the faces staring at him with anger and disgust, and for the first time his confidence seemed to shake a little. He straightened his suit and said, "This is not over, David. I am giving you one chance to leave Lagos peacefully. If you do not take it, then everything that happens next will be your fault." And with those words, Patrick turned and walked out of the clinic with his bodyguards following behind him, leaving a room full of shocked and angry people. David turned to his mother, who was crying softly on the bed, and he sat down beside her and took her hand. He asked her if what Patrick said was true, and Margaret nodded slowly with shame in her eyes. She said, "I am sorry, David. I never told you because I had no proof. Patrick destroyed all the documents and paid everyone to lie for him. I tried to fight him, but I was just a poor widow with no power and no connections. Who would believe me over a rich chief?" David felt anger burning in his chest like a fire that would not go out, and he made a decision right there that would change everything. He said, "Mama, do not worry. I am not the powerless little boy I was 22 years ago. I am a billionaire now with my own connections and my own power, and I promise you that Patrick will pay for what he did to us." Margaret squeezed his hand and said, "Please be careful, David. Patrick is a dangerous man. He has destroyed many people who try to fight him." David smiled and said, "Let him come. I am not afraid of him. And when I am finished with him, he will wish he had never touched what belonged to my family." But what David did not know was that Patrick was already making phone calls, already putting plans in motion, and the danger was coming faster than anyone expected. That very night, while David was sleeping in a hotel room and Samuel was closing his food stall, Patrick's men were moving through the shadows with orders to destroy everything and everyone that David cared about. Who will Patrick target first, and will David be able to protect the people he loves from an enemy who has no conscience? The night was dark and quiet in Oshodi market, the kind of quiet that comes after the chaos of the day when all the traders have gone home and the streets are empty except for stray dogs and the homeless people who sleep in corners. Samuel was packing up his stall like he did every night, carefully washing his pots and covering his table with the old blue tarp that had protected his small business for so many years. He was thinking about everything that had happened that day, the reunion between David and Margaret, the confrontation with Chief Patrick, and the feeling that something big was about to change in all their lives. Samuel had never imagined that feeding a homeless old woman would lead to all of this, meeting a billionaire and standing up to a powerful chief, and he wondered what tomorrow would bring. As he lifted his last pot to carry it to the small storage room he rented nearby, Samuel heard footsteps behind him, not the normal footsteps of people passing by, but heavy, deliberate footsteps of people who were coming specifically for him. He turned around and saw four men standing in the shadows, their faces covered with masks and their hands holding wooden clubs and iron rods. Samuel's heart began to beat fast because he knew immediately that these were not robbers looking for money. Robbers would have demanded his money by now. These men were here for something else. One of the men stepped forward and said, "Chief Patrick sends his greetings, food seller. He told us to give you a message that you will never forget." Before Samuel could run or call for help, the men attacked him, swinging their weapons and hitting him again and again while he tried to protect his head with his arms. The pain was terrible, and Samuel fell to the ground as the blows kept coming, and he could feel his bones breaking and his skin tearing and his blood spilling onto the dusty ground of the market he had worked in for 15 years. The men beat him until he stopped moving, and then the leader bent down and whispered in Samuel's ear, "This is what happens to poor men who think they can stand up to rich men. Next time, keep your mouth shut." And then they disappeared into the night, leaving Samuel lying in a pool of his own blood, barely breathing and barely alive. It was a young boy who found Samuel the next morning, a street child who used to come to Samuel's stall for free food and who considered the food seller to be the closest thing he had to a father. The boy screamed for help, and soon a crowd gathered around Samuel's broken body, and someone called for an ambulance while others tried to stop the bleeding with whatever cloth they could find. When David received the phone call telling him what had happened, he was eating breakfast in his hotel room, and the food turned to ash in his mouth as he listened to the terrible news. He rushed to the hospital where Samuel had been taken and found the food seller lying in a bed wrapped in bandages, his face so swollen and bruised that he was almost unrecognizable. David stood by the bed looking at the man who had saved his mother's life, the man who had stood up to Patrick without any fear, and he felt a rage building inside him that was unlike anything he had ever felt before. Samuel opened his eyes slowly when he heard someone enter the room, and when he saw David standing there, he tried to smile, but his broken lips could not form the shape. David took Samuel's hand gently and said, "I am so sorry, my friend. This happened because of me, because you stood up for my family." Samuel shook his head weakly and whispered in a voice that was rough with pain, "No, do not blame yourself. I knew the risk when I spoke up. Some things are worth fighting for even if you get hurt." David felt tears forming in his eyes, and he said, "I will make this right, Samuel. I will make sure Patrick pays for what he has done to you and to my mother. I promise you on my life." Samuel squeezed David's hand and said, "I believe you, but please be careful. Patrick is like a snake. He strikes when you least expect it. Do not let anger make you careless." David nodded and promised to be careful. And then he sat with Samuel for a long time, just keeping him company and making sure he knew that he was not alone. When David finally left the hospital, he made several phone calls. First to his lawyers in London telling them to prepare for a legal war, then to his contacts in the Nigerian government asking for meetings with people who had the power to investigate Patrick's crimes, and finally to a private security company asking them to send their best men to Lagos immediately. David was done playing nice. He was done being careful. Patrick had attacked someone he cared about, and now David was going to use every resource he had to bring the chief down. But David also knew that he needed proof of Patrick's crimes, the stolen properties, the bribery, the corruption. Without proof, even the most powerful lawyers and politicians would not be able to help him. And that is when David remembered something his mother had said in the clinic. She had said that Patrick had destroyed all the documents. But David knew from his years in business that documents are never truly destroyed. There are always copies somewhere, always records that people forget about. He needed to find those records, and he knew exactly where to start looking. David went to see his mother, who had been moved to a private hospital where she was receiving the best care money could buy, and he sat beside her bed and asked her to tell him everything she remembered about his father's business with Patrick. Margaret was still weak, but her mind was clear, and she told David about the old office building where Joseph and Patrick used to work together, a building in the Victoria Island area of Lagos that had been their first property. She said there used to be a safe in that building where your father kept all his important documents. I do not know if the building is still there or if the safe still exists, but that is the only place I can think of. David thanked his mother and kissed her forehead and told her to rest and get strong, because soon she would be living in a beautiful house where she would never have to worry about anything again. He left the hospital and drove to Victoria Island with Thomas, his investigator. and they searched for the old building that Margaret had described until they found it, a rundown structure that looked like it had not been used in many years. The building was locked, but David was not going to let a locked door stop him. He called a locksmith, and within an hour they were inside the dusty, abandoned office. They searched every room looking for the safe that Margaret had mentioned, moving old furniture and looking behind walls until finally, in a back room covered with cobwebs and rat droppings, they found it, a large metal safe built into the wall. David's heart was pounding as he called another specialist to come and open the safe. And after 2 hours of careful work, the heavy door finally swung open. Inside the safe were stacks of old papers yellow with age, documents and contracts and receipts that had been sitting there untouched for over 20 years. And as David began to read through them, his eyes grew wide with shock. The documents proved everything. They showed that Joseph had owned 50% of all the properties he and Patrick had bought together. They showed that Patrick had forged signatures and created fake documents to transfer everything into his own name after Joseph died. And they showed payments to lawyers and judges who had helped him cover up his crimes. David held the papers in his hands like they were made of gold because these documents were the weapons he needed to destroy Patrick. But as David was celebrating his discovery, his phone rang and the number on the screen was unknown. He answered and heard Patrick's voice on the other end, cold and threatening. Patrick said, "I know you found the office, David. I have people watching you everywhere you go, and I am calling to tell you that if you try to use whatever you found against me, something very bad will happen to your mother." David felt his blood run cold, and Patrick continued talking. Patrick said, "Right now, I have men waiting outside the hospital where Margaret is staying. If you go to the police or try to expose me, I will make sure you lose your mother again, and this time it will be permanent." The line went dead, and David stood frozen with the documents in his hand and terror in his heart. David had the proof he needed to bring Patrick to justice, but now his mother's life was hanging in the balance. What will David do when he is forced to choose between justice and the life of the woman he just found after 22 years? Subscribe now and turn on notifications because Chapter 7 will push David to his breaking point and force him to make an impossible decision. David stood in the abandoned building holding the documents that could destroy Patrick, but his hands were shaking because the phone call had changed everything. His mother was in danger again, and this time the threat was real and immediate. Patrick had men watching the hospital ready to hurt Margaret if David made any move against him. For a moment, David felt like that helpless 8-year-old boy again, the boy who could not protect his mother from the fire, the boy who lost everything in one terrible night. But then he remembered who he had become. He was not a helpless child anymore. He was a billionaire with resources and connections, and he had not built an empire by giving up when things got difficult. David turned to Thomas and said, "We need to move fast. Call the security team I hired and tell them to get to the hospital now. I want my mother protected by people I trust, not by hospital security." Thomas nodded and immediately began making calls while David stood thinking about his next move. He knew that Patrick expected him to be scared and to back down. That is what Patrick was used to, people being afraid of his power and his threats. But David was not going to play by Patrick's rules. David made his own phone call to a man named Chief Adeyemi, a powerful politician who David had done business with in the past, a man who owed David a favor because David had once saved his company from bankruptcy. When Chief Adeyemi answered the phone, David explained the situation quickly, telling him about Patrick's crimes and the documents he had found and the threat against his mother. Chief Adeyemi listened carefully, and when David finished talking, the politician was quiet for a moment before saying, "David, I always knew Patrick was a criminal, but nobody has ever had proof before. If what you are saying is true, then I can help you, but we need to be smart about this." David asked what Chief Adeyemi had in mind, and the politician explained his plan. He said, "I have friends in the police force who are honest men. Men who cannot be bought by Patrick. I will arrange for them to arrest Patrick tonight, but we need to make sure your mother is safe first." David agreed, and they spent the next hour coordinating their plan. Every detail had to be perfect because one mistake could cost Margaret her life. While all this was happening, Samuel was lying in his hospital bed, unable to sleep because his body was in too much pain, and he was thinking about David and Margaret and praying that God would protect them from Patrick's evil. A nurse came into his room to check on him, and Samuel asked her if there was any news about the old woman Margaret, and the nurse smiled sadly and said she had heard that Margaret was doing better, but that there was some kind of trouble at her hospital. Samuel felt worried because he had grown to love Margaret like a mother over the past 5 years, and the thought of anything bad happening to her made his heart ache even more than his broken bones. He wished he could get up and help, but his body was too damaged. All he could do was lie there and pray and trust that David knew what he was doing. Back at Margaret's hospital, David's security team had arrived, 6 trained men who positioned themselves around her room and at every entrance to the building. David himself went to see his mother and found her awake and frightened because she had somehow sensed that something was wrong. Margaret grabbed David's hand and said, "What is happening, my son? I can see the fear in your eyes even though you are trying to hide it." David did not want to lie to his mother, so he told her the truth. He said, "Patrick has threatened to hurt you if I use the evidence I found against him. But do not worry, Mama, I have a plan, and I will not let him touch you." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, and she said, "David, please just let it go. Forget about the money and the properties. I do not care about any of that. I only care about having you back in my life. Please do not risk everything for revenge." David shook his head and said, "This is not about revenge, Mama. This is about justice. Patrick has hurt too many people, and he will keep hurting people unless someone stops him. You taught me to stand up for what is right, and that is what I am doing." Margaret looked at her son with pride and sorrow mixed together, and she said, "You have become a good man, David. Your father would be so proud of you." David kissed his mother's forehead and told her to rest, promising that everything would be over soon. As midnight approached, David received a message from Chief Adeyemi saying that the honest police officers were ready and waiting for the signal to arrest Patrick at his mansion. But first, David needed to deal with the men Patrick had watching the hospital. He could not risk them hurting his mother when they heard that their boss had been arrested. David's security team had identified 3 of Patrick's men lurking around the hospital, and David gave the order for them to be quietly captured and held until the operation was over. His men moved like shadows through the hospital, and within 20 minutes, all 3 of Patrick's spies had been grabbed and tied up in an empty storage room where they could not warn anyone or cause any trouble. With his mother now safe, David sent the signal to Chief Adeyemi, and the operation began. At exactly 1 o'clock in the morning, a team of police officers arrived at Patrick's mansion and surrounded the building. And when Patrick came to the door demanding to know what was happening, they showed him the arrest warrant and the evidence that David had provided. Patrick's face went white with shock and then red with rage as he realized what had happened. He screamed that this was a mistake and that he would have all their jobs. But the officers did not listen to his threats. They put handcuffs on his wrists and led him out of his mansion in front of his servants and neighbors. And for the first time in his life, Chief Patrick Okonkwo knew what it felt like to be powerless. When David received the call confirming that Patrick had been arrested, he fell to his knees and thanked God for giving him victory over his enemy. He rushed to tell his mother the good news, and when Margaret heard that Patrick was in jail, she began to cry tears of joy and relief. 22 years of fear and suffering finally coming to an end. The next morning, the news of Patrick's arrest was all over Lagos. The newspapers and television stations were full of stories about the powerful chief who had been exposed as a fraud and a thief. People who Patrick had cheated and threatened over the years began coming forward with their own stories, and it became clear that David and Margaret were not his only victims. David visited Samuel in the hospital to tell him what had happened, and Samuel laughed despite the pain in his broken ribs. Samuel said, "God is good, my friend. The wicked man has fallen and the righteous have been lifted up. This is how it should always be." David held Samuel's hand and said, "None of this would have happened without you. If you had not fed my mother all those years, she would have died, and I would never have found her. You are the real hero of this story, Samuel." Samuel shook his head and said, "I am no hero. I am just a poor food seller who did what any decent person should do. The hero is you, David, for having the courage to fight for justice." The 2 men looked at each other with respect and friendship, 2 people from completely different worlds who had been brought together by one act of kindness. But even as David celebrated his victory, there was still one more thing he needed to do, one more promise he needed to keep. He had told Samuel that his life would never be the same, and David was a man who always kept his promises. Patrick was in jail and justice had been served, but David's mission was not yet complete. He still had to fulfill his promise to Samuel and restore everything that had been stolen from his mother. But what David planned next would shock everyone and prove that kindness always returns to those who give it freely. 6 months had passed since Patrick was arrested, and the world had changed completely for everyone in this story. The courts had moved quickly because the evidence against Patrick was so strong and so clear that even the best lawyers he hired could not save him from justice. Patrick was found guilty of fraud and theft and forgery and bribery, and the judge sentenced him to 25 years in prison with no chance of early release. But more importantly, the court ordered that all the properties Patrick had stolen from Joseph's family must be returned to Margaret and David, properties that were now worth hundreds of millions of naira after 22 years of growth and development. Margaret, who had spent 2 decades sleeping on the streets and begging for food, was now one of the richest women in Lagos, but the money meant nothing to her compared to having her son back in her life. David had moved his mother into a beautiful mansion in the Ikoyi area of Lagos, a house with large gardens and comfortable rooms and servants who treated her like the queen she deserved to be. Every morning, Margaret would wake up in her soft bed and look around at the beautiful room and thank God for the miracle that had brought her son back to her. But Margaret never forgot where she came from, and she never forgot the people who had helped her survive during her darkest years. She insisted that David help her set up a foundation to feed and shelter homeless people in Lagos. And within months, the Margaret Foundation was providing meals to thousands of hungry people every single day. Margaret herself would sometimes visit the feeding centers to serve food with her own hands because she wanted the homeless people to know that someone who understood their suffering was fighting for them. But of all the blessings that flowed from this story, none was greater than what happened to Samuel the food seller. On a bright Saturday morning 3 months after Patrick's arrest, David came to Oshodi Market, where Samuel had returned to his small food stall after recovering from his injuries. Samuel was surprised to see David because he had assumed that now that everything was settled, the billionaire would return to his life in London and forget about the poor food seller. But David had not forgotten. In fact, he had been planning something special for Samuel ever since the day he made his promise in the hospital. David asked Samuel to close his stall and come with him because there was something he wanted to show him. And even though Samuel was confused, he trusted David and agreed to go. They drove through the streets of Lagos in David's expensive car, and Samuel looked out the window wondering where they were going. Finally, they arrived at a large building in a nice area of Lagos, a beautiful 3-story structure with big windows and a sign that read Samuel's Kitchen. Samuel looked at the building and then looked at David with confusion in his eyes, not understanding what he was seeing. David smiled and said, "This is yours, Samuel. This restaurant belongs to you. I built it and set it up and hired staff to work here. All you have to do is run it and keep doing what you love, which is feeding people." Samuel could not speak. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out because his brain could not process what David was telling him. David continued talking and said, "But that is not all, my friend. Come inside and see." They walked into the restaurant, and Samuel saw a beautiful modern kitchen with the best equipment money could buy, tables and chairs that were clean and new, and a team of workers who all clapped and cheered when Samuel entered. David led Samuel to a back office where there was a desk with some papers on it, and David explained that these papers showed that Samuel was now the owner of not just this restaurant, but also the building it was in and 2 other properties nearby. David said, "You saved my mother's life, Samuel. You fed her for 5 years when you could barely feed yourself. There is no amount of money that can repay that kind of kindness, but I hope this is a good start." Samuel finally found his voice, and he said, "David, this is too much. I cannot accept all of this. I am just a simple man. I do not know how to be rich." David laughed and put his hand on Samuel's shoulder and said, "You will learn, my friend. And besides, being rich does not change who you are inside. You will still be the same kind and generous Samuel. You will just have more resources to help more people." Samuel felt tears rolling down his face, and he did something he had never done before. He hugged David tightly like a brother and thanked him over and over again. From that day forward, Samuel's Kitchen became the most popular restaurant in Lagos, not because the food was fancy, but because it was made with love and because Samuel never forgot his roots. Every day at closing time, Samuel would pack up all the leftover food and personally deliver it to the homeless people in Oshodi Market, the same people he used to share his small meals with when he had almost nothing. He hired other poor people to work in his restaurant, giving jobs to those who society had forgotten, and he became known throughout Lagos as the food seller who never stopped giving. David returned to London to manage his business empire, but he came back to Lagos every few months to visit his mother and his friend Samuel. Margaret lived happily in her beautiful house, surrounded by love and comfort, and she spent her remaining years doing good works and helping others. She would often tell people that the years she spent on the streets were not wasted because that suffering had taught her what really matters in life. It is not money or power or success. It is love and kindness and the connections we make with other human beings. And whenever she told her story, she always made sure to mention Samuel, the poor food seller who had seen her when everyone else looked away. The simple man whose daily act of kindness had started a chain of events that restored a family and transformed a community. Samuel and David remained close friends for the rest of their lives, two men from different worlds who had been brought together by the mysterious workings of fate. They would often sit together in the evenings talking about life and laughing about how strange the journey had been. Samuel would say, "Who would have believed that feeding one old woman would lead to all of this?" And David would reply, "That is how God works, my friend. He takes our small offerings and multiplies them into blessings we could never imagine." The story of the poor food seller and the billionaire's mother spread throughout Nigeria and beyond, inspiring countless people to look at the homeless and forgotten with new eyes. People began to understand that every person on the street has a story and a family somewhere, and that sometimes a simple act of kindness can be the beginning of a miracle. And the lesson that echoed through this story was one that African grandmothers have been teaching their children for generations. What you give to the world will always come back to you. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but someday when you least expect it, the seeds of kindness you plant will grow into a harvest of blessings. Samuel had given a hungry widow some rice and stew, and in return he received a new life. David had searched for his mother with a heart full of love, and in return he found not just his mother, but a brother in Samuel. And Margaret, who had lost everything and suffered for 22 years, in the end she gained more than she had ever lost: a son who loved her, a friend who had saved her, and a legacy of kindness that would live on long after she was gone. This is how the story ends, not with sadness but with joy, not with revenge but with redemption, not with hatred but with love. And so we come to the end of this beautiful journey that started with one poor food seller and one forgotten widow on the dusty streets of Lagos. We hope this story has touched your heart and reminded you that kindness is never wasted, and that every human being deserves to be seen and valued. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to our channel if you have not already, and leave a comment telling us what part of the story touched you the most. Remember that you do not need to be rich to change someone's life. Sometimes all it takes is a plate of food, a kind word, or simply seeing someone who the world has made invisible. Go out and be like Samuel. Plant seeds of kindness wherever you go, and trust that one day those seeds will grow into blessings you cannot even imagine. And if you enjoy this story, please subscribe, share, like, and comment. Thank you for watching, and may God bless you abundantly.